Hello and welcome to our panel today. This panel is a panel about the local perspective, and we will be discussing, how the local perspective can fit into the larger picture. Together with me, two colleagues, Fabrizio Ricciardelli, Director of Kent State University, and Portia Prebys, the President of the AACUPI Association. My name is Sasha Perugini. I am the director of the Syracuse University Florence program, as you can see from the picture behind me. And I'm also the co-chair of the OSAC Regional Steering Committee. OSAC stands for Overseas Security Advisory Council. So the panel will talk about, the local perspective and how, how the local perspective can contribute in the larger discussions. I will start by an overview, a general kind of somewhat necessarily a bit superficial, but just a overview of the changes in education abroad in the last 50 years. Then I will pass the word to my colleague Fabrizio, and then we will have the Q&A. So let me share my screen to start with the PowerPoint that can help us. Here we are. Share. Okay. So this is the title of our panel, Local Perspective in Study Abroad. Is Italy a true success story? I will be focusing on the changes in education abroad, the global perspective. In other words, I want to talk about how the global perspective and the local perspective are following same parallel threads. First of all, let me quickly introduce some key developments, some key changes that have taken place in the last 50 years that have affected quite significantly our, not only the way we work, but also the way we think about education abroad. First of all, a major change has been the transition or the shift into thinking about the mission and vision of the education abroad. Most operations started from an idea of sending students or facilitating an experience of students abroad in the local culture so that they could be exposed to the local culture. In particularly at the beginning, this was tied to learning the local language, learning the local culture, which in Florence, if I think about the first pictures that I've seen of the students coming to study in Italy, the first curricula that I saw that date back 60 years were mostly tied to the local resources, and hence the curriculum was mostly focused on humanities and subjects such as history, literature, again, language and culture, and music. It depends, but pretty much it was very tied to what was the local, the perception of what the local culture was at the time. In parallel with these changes, there have been other changes in that there's a much stronger impetus now to help students find a job and to help students learn skills and learn a mindset that can help them in not only in finding a job, but also in figuring out a career path that is in a way effective and efficient. In the meantime, the academic research on internationalization has also developed significantly and has brought a lot of additional debate and discourses on what internationalization means, what it is, what are the key components of internationalization. And talking about the key components, another big change is that internationalization these days doesn't necessarily have to happen exclusively abroad, but it can happen on the main campus. There's been a parallel development of what it means to be offering, an international experience without leaving the premises. And then as COVID made it so, it's in some cases even, drastically evident the online component and what that means. I will talk about this in a few minutes, but the online, the distinction between, in-person and online is becoming more and more blurred. So these key developments have brought other changes and other developments. And let me just go do an overview. First of all, the academic changes. So I was talking about the online component. This was a heavy component even before COVID hit us all, but now has become, of course, the new standard. And most of the articles that we all have been reading and seeing on the Chronicle of Higher Education, on higher ed, and on all the on the channels through which we update each other. I'm sure we've all seen how a lot of these articles refer to this online, pedagogy as the new path of university. So this will have an enormous impact on study abroad, and I hope we can discuss further what that will mean in our Q&A session. In parallel, we've had a push or a drive or a desire to have more interdisciplinary approach to teaching, and so that the students can tie subjects more and more. So that again has affected the curricula in the abroad operations, which brought enormous curricular changes. As I was saying earlier, the Syracuse University Florence program, for instance, started with a very humanity-based curriculum, and now we offer architecture, we offer design, we offer engineering, we offer business, economics, and we attract students that not only want to study humanities for their electives, but often are able to take courses that count toward their major and not necessarily in the humanities. Because of the interdisciplinarity, because of the online component, of course, the pedagogy has changed incredibly. There was a moment in which the flipped class was, the buzzword. Now it's about the online and the component. It's about the combining the online and in-person, the hybrid forms. All of this, still we are all as teachers figuring out what is the best way, what is the format that works best for us and for our class and for the subject that we teach, depending on what we teach. But the point is that pedagogy is in flux and it's changing, particularly this last months and year has been changing very fast. This, of course, has affected the way language is taught, the way language is learned, the difference between pedagogy around language learning on main campus and in the accreditation abroad, and the importance of the language component within the curriculum abroad. And again, talking about curricular changes, of course, these extracurricular changes go in parallel with curricular changes, and because of the drive toward professionalizing students, there's also been an increase in the internships numbers and the community engagement. So these are the kind of, in short, the main academics changes that we have noticed and observed in our field. In terms of administration, here we have, again, a lot of big and important changes in the last 50 years. First of all, internationalization has started to be included in the strategic plans of the universities. So the universities have started to see that internationalization plays a growing role in institutional strategies. And this is true both locally and at home campuses. And senior administrators have slowly come to terms with the fact that it's necessary to have internationalization as a key point in the strategic plan of the university. To the point that the way the university handles internationalization is also often used to compare notes between one institution and another. And students often do check what education abroad what education abroad opportunities the institution offers when they want to pick an institution. Because of these 2 points, also there's been more tighter collaboration between the main campus offices and the abroad operations. So there's been more interaction, more control, more attention, and more structured collaboration. This also has meant to the development of different models. In fact, and this is something I will touch on at the end of this presentation, the program abroad have developed further. There are branch universities such as the Syracuse University or Kent State University, but also now we have providers. And for instance, that are consortia of university, for-profit organizations that offer the kind of services to a given university, so that university can just go to the provider and pick whichever model they prefer, rather than investing in a branch operation abroad. All these changes, of course, have, as a natural consequence, meant incredible changes in terms of costs and also income for the university. And the education abroad component has also meant a way to recruit more students in both international students, but also, by making the education abroad component appealing, also to attract US students. Another important change is the transformation of professional identities. Professionals in the field have become more and more specialized on one side, and on the other have been, the education abroad is such a field that often, particularly those that are in managing position or senior management positions, such as the local director, or I'm thinking about the senior administration above me, they have to become competent in more than one area, not simply admissions, or not simply marketing, and not simply safety, but all of these areas need to be known and mastered quite well. So the identities have become, on one side, more specialized, but on the other side also more fluid. And finally, there's a component of reputation. The reputation of the abroad operation impacts the reputation of the institution, and vice versa. Think about one student or a crime that happens abroad. This is the worst case scenario, crime or a bad news that hit the news, and how this impact the administration. COVID, for instance, no other issue, no other problem, no other tragedy before has impacted on the reputation of institutions in the way COVID has. In other words, there's been somewhat of a competition among institutions and of the abroad operation to kind of to monitor who was doing better at managing the students on the ground or abroad, who was doing better at repatriating them or not repatriating them. So all of these changes are impacting deeply our operations and the way we think about our operations. Then students have, of course, changed. We have talked about millennials for a long time. We are now talking about Gen Z and Gen A. A lot of literature on how students have changed, and it's not simply how they've changed, but also the students' numbers have changed. The big points that I would like, the big takeaways that I would like for us to keep in mind today is the growth of desire of students to do independent traveling, no matter how good we are at building or crafting or packaging for credit traveling experience, whether it's a traveling seminar, a signature seminar, whether it's a field trip. Students do like to have a component of independent traveling that goes in parallel with the education abroad experience or the abroad experience. Their mindset have changed. Of course, we know that. I think I've seen an increase of analysis of how students' mindset have changed during the Gen Y, the millennial generation, but now we are continuing to see that. I've been in this business in this field for about 20, 25 years, and never before I've seen so much literature on the student's mindset. I'm of course oversimplifying here, but they tend to have a do-it-all attitude. They're very interested in how the experience they're taking will turn into a professionalizing skill, how that experience will help their career. They're very goal-oriented. They have very tight programming. They're on a plan. They have their own plan and their idea of how, the months abroad have to shape up. Traveling is a priority for them. Immersing, on the other hand, is no longer a priority, no longer that important. And along the students' and parents' mindset that immersing locally is no longer a priority as it was in the past, the institutions have equally shifted from this point of view. They have their own online component, meaning that we teachers revert to online support for certain challenges or to make class simpler. For instance, we use Blackboard. Students have their own online component, which is not simply their social life or not simply how they entertain themselves, whether it's to watch a movie on Netflix or Amazon Prime, whatever, but they also can find content online. They can find how to do things, how they can find even kind of crash courses online. So these are other platforms that kind of constitute a way for them to either help themselves study or even question what is being said in class sometimes. Finally, students of the two last generations have often been described in a lot of literature that I've read as psychological fragile, and I'm going to put this down, although I do not believe this is true. Personally, I think that it's can't say the opposite, but it's the society that has become so complex, and the attention to the psychological traits and how a human being responds to challenges has become such an important topic that it's easy to put these generations into the, label them as psychological fragile. This could be a topic in itself for a different panel, but I'll leave it at that for now. For the moment, I just want to stick to the overview. And of course, because of the changes in students' mindset, student services have changed. Housing, the expectations of housing these days is to replicate what it's at home. So the idea of going with local is really a challenge. For instance, in Italy, I'm sure we're all familiar with the difference in using heating or using air conditioning. That's the most simple example that I can make, but the expectation is not to go with a local habit. And that's where thank goodness, because that's where we can do our job into crossing the cultural bridges. Food, again, expectation to find sometimes a romanticized version of the cultural of the local culture. Language, yes, there is an awareness that it's locally we may have a different language, but sometimes there is an expectation, even unconscious, that people will speak English on the ground. There is an expectation of psychological and medical support, much more than in the past, and a 360 degrees assistance, and a sense of the educational broad being that has to be more customer oriented versus more educational. So more attention to the again, the expectations and how the experience fulfills those expectations, which is a little bit of a paradox with what we do. Then again, talking about changes, competition has changed. The number of competitors has increased enormously. Fabrizio will talk about how many programs we have in Italy right after me. And I hope that in the Q&A session, we'll talk about the other nations, but the numbers of competitors has increased enormously. And not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of models. There are providers now, and there are new ways of doing the abroad experience. And many of these are growing online. So again, this is another big phenomenon that is taking place and has taken momentum with COVID. There's the phenomenon of co-petition, which is part competition and part cooperation. And I see this a lot in Italy. We collaborate a lot on the ground with other colleagues to share best practices, to talk about challenges. We join forces. AACUPI is the most Latin example of this co-petition. We should be competing for numbers, but the true competition happens before students arrive. Once they're on the ground, we all collaborate closely to figure out how to, how to go about each challenge, and particularly for those challenges that really affect all of us. We also are now facing the competition with the Erasmus model, the European model of study abroad, which is, that goes together with institutional agreements, less focused on services, but more and more European universities are offering courses in English, which again opens up the competition with our own operations. And then again, the online content platforms, of which I've already taught, but just to add one example, Google has launched its certificates recently, and MOOCs, platforms such as Khan Academy. So all of these are platforms where students can find content and sometimes even certifications that will give some credibility to what they have been studying. Then we have the legal and fiscal matters have become more complex. The liability has become kind of an ordinary word or an ordinary thought that we all have learned to live with. The number of specialized consultants involved in managing the operation abroad is growing. Immigration laws change. And then there are the big issues such as globalization, the growing complexity of cross-border activities. I didn't list it, the global warming and how, flights impact global warming. This is another issue, but, fiscal complexity is worthless for me to say it, but basically the world is becoming faster and more complex. Finally, some additional elements, parental involvement that has become a managing aspect. We have to, whenever we prepare a plan, whenever we prepare, let's say, a marketing plan, we do now have to think about parents. We do have to prepare Q&A sessions for parents. We have to, was not like this 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now parental involvement has a management category of itself. So this has become the routine, and again, has rendered operations more complex again. Job market, the job market has changed, and now to have a study abroad experience is important for a prospective employer and for a prospective candidate or employee. Job market is requesting certain skills, and the university try to stay up with what the job market is asking to ensure that the students have the skills that are needed. The complex global changes that I just mentioned, more awareness of interconnectedness, and then the complexities related to integration, race, and gender, and the fluidity of professional roles. Talking about integration, race, and gender, one point that I forgot to mention in the students' expectations earlier is that another issue that is growing, can't say issue, but a big change that is taking shape and evolving is that how students perception of their identity is stronger and stronger while they arrive in the abroad destination, and their perception of themselves and how they are, what they're finding when they arrive, and how they expect to be seen or expect to be spoken of, for instance, whether a language has a gender pronoun or not. This also has become a huge challenge these days. But going back to this slide, the additional elements, the fluidity of professional roles. Mostly in conversation, because literature, I haven't found this much, but there's a tendency to still think of administrators on one side and teachers on the other and researchers or scholars on the other. And this is no longer true, because as I'm speaking, I am a director, hence an administrator, I'm a teacher, and I also do research and study. The fact that I'm here presenting at this conference talks about my scholarly profile. So it's not possible to classify roles in such a stark way as it was in the past. Either you're an administrator or a teacher. And this is particularly true in the study abroad field on the ground, particularly true in many of my colleagues in Italy in study abroad are directors and also teacher, and also a lot of assistant directors. And I know whether they're assistant director for health and wellness, or assistant directors for student life, or assistant director for academics, they all are both teachers and administrators. So there's a different framing or a different perception of the professional roles. So finally, what are the results and consequences of all these changes? I've summarized 4 main ones, and I'm sure there are many others. And again, I'm very much looking forward to our Q&A session. I hope you will all have a lot of questions, and I hope we can turn this into a rich debate. The 4 ones that I wanted to bring up today are the increased level and depth of responsibility for administrator, and not just locally. Yes, locally we are responsible, the responsibility is increasing, but also the superior, like above me on main campus, their responsibilities have increased enormously. And we pretty much try to do, to cover all the areas that often in a universities are covered by different people in different offices. So for this reason, there is an increasing specialization in the role, but that goes hand in hand with the fluidity of the role. So again, as I was saying, each director of an abroad operation typically has to be fully competent on many fields: logistics, marketing, communication, academics, curriculum, pedagogy, recruiting, safety, name it. So again, the over-specialization goes hand in hand with this kind of growth of the role at a 360 degrees. And because of us on the ground having to go through this learning process and learning curve, the superiors above us have to do the same, which this transforms in a way kind of in our operation in mini bonsai universities abroad. So the operations abroad, particularly the large programs such as, let's say, Syracuse University, have become kind of a somewhat of a mini, like really very small replica of what the main campus and what the mothership does, which of course has an enormous impact on costs and expectations. I'll leave it at that. I'm going to end here. I will leave the word to my colleague Fabrizio Ricciardelli, who will dive into the Italian scenario. I hope this was a clear overview of the changes, so that again, during the Q&A, we can talk more in depth about other countries and what we can learn from these changes and what we can expect moving forward. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you at the Q&A session.